Oh, yet we trust that somehow good will be the final goal of ill, to pangs of nature, sins of will, defects of doubt, and taints of blood. That nothing walks with aimless feet, that not one life shall be destroyed, or cast as rubbish to the void, when God hath made the pile complete. That not a worm is cloven in vain, that not a moth with vain desire is shrivelled in a fruitless fire, or but subserves another's gain.
Details of In Memoriam have correspondences with the work as a whole. I could choose any number of passages to illustrate what I mean, which is pretty much my point. The example I'm going to use is part 54.
Behold, we know not anything. I can but trust that good shall fall, at last, far off, at last, to all, and every winter change to spring. So runs my dream, but what am I? An infant crying in the night, an infant crying for the light, and with no language but a cry.
Tennyson uses the same verse form throughout In Memoriam. It's written in quatrains, or verses of 4 lines, and throughout he maintains a metre of iambic tetrameter. Tetrameter because there are 4 beats in every line, and iambic because every second syllable is stressed. There is no variation, which is remarkable for such a long work. The rhyme scheme is also consistent, A, B, B, A, and this gives a curious sense of movement to the individual verses. There's a couplet in the middle which makes it feel like we're gaining momentum, but then the 4th line rhymes with the 1st, and it feels in a way like we haven't gone anywhere. And that exemplifies an important point about In Memoriam. Often we feel like the poet is not getting anywhere. And this is all entirely appropriate. The circularity of In Memoriam is suited to the process of grieving. In Memoriam as an overall work writes large what the critic Christopher Ricks has said about the individual stanzas, suited to turning round rather than going forward. As in part 54, we get questions that don't yield answers, movements without resolution. Tennyson is even uncertain of the whole point of writing the poem. Tennyson understands his own act of writing as therapeutic, but he finds that it can only numb him. It can't ultimately cure what he calls large grief. In Memoriam is a self-aware poem which monitors its own acts of creativity. Tennyson encounters other problems in the act of versifying, and he communicates these to us. For example, like a true Platonist, Tennyson imagines that in death, Hallam has moved nearer a state of perfection in God. But this creates a difficulty for Tennyson's poetry. How could it hope to represent adequately its glorified subject? And that is assuming that death is anything like Tennyson imagines to begin with, and he realizes that problem too. So In Memoriam is characterized by these contradictory or self-defeating impulses. In this circularity and uncertainty, In Memoriam has an uneasy relationship to the elegiac tradition. And this is how we would most obviously classify the work, as elegy. But we expect elegy to move towards consolation, particularly religious consolation, derived from the resurrection of Christ and his promise of eternal life. In part 3, I'm going to explain that new kinds of knowledge that arose in Tennyson's lifetime complicate any potential movement towards consolation and acceptance. What I want to accentuate now is that we can see Tennyson's wavering and inconsistency as a realistic exploration of bereavement, which is not a linear progress from loss towards acceptance. Consider, for example, part 14, in which Tennyson imagines that the ship due from Italy carries not Hallam's body, but the still living Hallam. You could call this denial, an act of pretense against knowledge that Hallam survives. Though the fantasy is unstable, as Tennyson here portrays Hallam as a living sympathiser with Tennyson's grief, a grief which proceeds, of course, from Hallam's death. So Tennyson knows it is an impossibility. He is sustaining a fantasy in his mind. Mourning is a process in which we decide whether our changed reality is bearable, whether we can live with our loss. But we shouldn't expect steady progress from one point to the other, from loss to acceptance. It's not a linear trajectory. Unwillingness to accept Hallam's death interferes with Tennyson's process of mourning, and his doubts about religion overshadow the commonplace forms of appeasement and reassurance that are available to him.